Hi, everyone. Welcome to another podcast from the Horse's Advocate. This is Doc T. Geoff Tucker is my name. And this one's going to be an eclectic one, meaning that I have about 4 different things I want to go over. I've got so many things in my brain that have happened in the past week or two. Been really busy taking care of horses' teeth, running around the countryside. I apologize. I haven't been getting these podcasts out. But I've been doing a lot of work, and I went to 4 different seminars, and I'm going to go over each one of them. I will let you know up front that I was kind of disappointed in all of them. The first one was put on by Cornell University, not the vet school, but the regular university. In March 24th, Lindsay Godell, DVM, had a webinar called How Horses Think. And I was so excited to watch this because I really thought I was going to get a lot of information out of it. And it turns out it was mostly about animal welfare. And that just, I don't know, you set your expectations high for one thing, like how does a horse actually think? And they go into animal welfare right from the start. They wanted to put forward this idea that the 3 F's are important, which is freedom, friends, and forage. Freedom meaning that they allow free exercise and movement. 2, friends is allow interactions with other horses. And 3, forage means they have access to forage. And I think everyone agrees that would be an ideal world for a horse. I think most people understand that it's hard to get a lot of space for these horses these days. But then they went right into a framework for horse welfare. And they asked us to list all the things that we thought were important to identify something is wrong with horses. And the first thing was neglect or overwork, intentional or not, abuse, misunderstanding or miscommunication, which just means using a crop on them, I think, and deprivation of normal behavior. Well, the fact that a horse is behind a fence tells me that that's abnormal behavior right from the start. So I think this person, Dr. Godell of Cornell, the 4-H ag extension agent for New York, needs to understand that horses today are not kept the way horses were kept 100 years ago. We have to understand that most of them are behind a fence someplace. A lot of them are kept in stalls, whether they like it or not. I've known plenty of horses that rather be in a stall on a hot summer's day behind a fan or out of the cold wind of wet winter. But I've also known horses that prefer standing out in the cold of winter behind a windbreak, and they do just fine. So I think a lot of people have to get together to understand what is truly an animal welfare, horse welfare issue. I think we need to find veterinarians. We need to find horsemen who've been around 40, 50, 60, 70 years with horses and talk about how horses were kept then and how horses are kept now. Plenty of books have been written about this from the past in the 1800s. And this gal needs to understand that animal welfare is an interpretation. I think that's what I'm trying to say. She went on to say that the evolution of the horse has been over the past 50 million years. I've heard as far as 55 million years, but what's the 5 million years amongst 50? They were free ranging. They were among friends. They had access to grasslands. They're large, herbivores, social, and they were prey animals. Okay. Well, we all can agree with that. I mean, we don't have to be rocket scientists to figure that one out. Then she said that they have a small stomach, so they are, quote, trickle feeders. Now, I've heard this expression before, trickle feeders, that they take a little bit in and they're constantly eating throughout the day. I've yet to see the data on this because I just don't believe it. But they go on to give me some data that kind of goes around this and trying to make a point, but I'm not sure that they are truly trickle feeders, that I think that they have a time of grazing and a time of rest. And she goes on to say that they've done some time budget for horses, and free ranging horses, 60% of their time is spent grazing, with 20% standing, 10% lying down, and 10% other, which just means they're going to the water pond or doing something. So that adds up to 100%, but they said 6% of the time they're grazing. Now, I've been saying this for about 1 billion years because that's how old I am, that horses, if they chew 1 chew per second, and they chew up to 40,000 chews per day, according to Dr. Catherine Haupt, professor emeritus at Cornell University in behavior. I think that with 86,400 seconds in a day, that 40,000 looks to me about 50%. So I'd say 50 to 60% is a ballpark, but the rest of the time they're not eating. So there's proof that half a day or so, they're not eating. So they shouldn't have food in front of them 24/7. So on one hand, she's saying horses should have food in front of them 24/7 because they're trickle feeders. And then the next moment, they say that they're only eating for 6% of the time. This is where a lot of things get a little messed up. Then she shows some statistics of stalled horses, where they said 15% of the time is spent eating, 65% standing, 15% lying, and 5% other. And I'm like, 65% standing? The horses that I see are almost always doing something, but they don't seem too unhappy about it. I think they stand around a lot. So what is animal welfare in this case? Is 65% standing that bad compared to 20% standing in free range? But on the other hand, while grazing, standing, lying, and other, they are worried about being attacked. Whereas when they're stalled, they don't have to worry about being attacked. They can live a more comfortable life without high cortisol levels due to stress. Or maybe they do have high cortisol levels because they're staying in a stall. I think a much better study would be to measure what the cortisol levels are to see what kind of stress these horses are going through. But then again, just drawing the blood in some of these horses will raise cortisol levels. So the whole idea of this topic was to tell me how a horse thinks. And so far, I'm not seeing anything in here. And I feel like I've wasted my time and thus wasted your time. But I'll go on with a few more things. They said the horse's vision is unilateral and wide to the side. So they basically look out to the left and out to the right, but they don't look with binocular vision very much. It's a very narrow field straight ahead. They also said that they had limited color vision, where yellows and grays seem to be the predominant colors. And if you put your jumps into yellow, you'll have decreased number of hits by the horse into the rail, and you'll have improved form of the horse. I thought that was kind of interesting. They also talked about the vibraceae, which are the sensing hairs. And they said trimming these sensing hairs around the muzzle will increase risk of injury. And I think most people now know that trimming the nose hairs while making them look good isn't in the best interest of the horse. So leaving those hairs there is probably the best. And finally, they talk about intelligence, and they said the basal ganglia of humans go to the prefrontal cortex where we think, but with the horse, it goes to the motor cortex where the automatic reaction of horses. I'm not sure I fully agree with that. I think that there is a lot of movement between the vision or the hearing or whatever senses, and they go into the amygdala and they work on the right limbic system to get some of these emotions first before they do think. I do agree with that. But I think that was more than an oversimplification of intelligence and cognition in a horse. So I really didn't get much out of that. And finally, they talked about body language with the horse grimace scale. Maybe some of you saw that, where somebody did a study about the grimace a horse makes, their ears going back, their eyes, et cetera. And you can tell if the horse is happy or sad. And I think anybody who's been around horses can see that without having to look at a scale. But that was one thing that I went to. And as far as I'm concerned, that was a bust. I really don't have anything to tell you on that. Second, the one I went to was a European Equine Nutrition and Health Conference. And I was so excited to go to this because it was all about fiber intake, fermentation, and dental condition. Saying, this is great. I can't wait. And again, to me, it was a letdown. They talked about chewing efficiency. They compared ruminants versus horses. And they said the gut microbiome pokes holes in the cellulose, but doesn't affect the particle size. I thought that was interesting because I've always said that if you have large particle sizes in the manure, it's probably because the gut microbiome isn't working. Interesting side note, just happened today. I found a horse that has had some digestive upsets with borderline colics this past week. And they've decided to change the diet, and they put the horse on chopped hay. Now, this hay was maybe an inch long. Yeah, maybe an inch and a half, which is like 25 to 35 millimeters. And they're spending a lot of money doing it. They're pouring into the bucket. The horse is lifting it, plopping it into the water, and it's a thick layer of this chopped hay in the water that the horse is eating. And I checked his teeth, and the teeth are in great shape. There really is no problem with the teeth. And I said to the people, why are you chopping the hay and going to all this trouble? The horse is grinding it up. They said, well, the veterinarian said that the horse probably isn't grinding it up, and this is going to make it better. I said, here, let me show you something. And I let this horse chew hay, and you could see the hay stem still sticking out of the mouth. And I said, hold on. And I stuck my hand in. I reached all the way back to the last teeth, and I pulled out the chewed up grass that had made it from the lips to the very back teeth. I pulled it out, and I showed it to him. And these things were about, I don't know, a quarter of an inch long, which is like 5 millimeters long. They were so finely ground instantly that I said, why are you spending money chopping hay and buying this stuff when the horse is chewing it? It gets much finer particle size than you can ever do chopping it. And she had no response. It was kind of funny. But the horse can chop hay pretty well. It's said that the horses don't use the microbes at all as food, which I thought was interesting. I've never heard of the microbiome being used as food. And these guys said the horses don't use the microbes at all. So to me, this wasn't earth-shattering piece of information. But it just surprised me. But they were able to look at the particle size of these of the hay of these horses, and they saw that no matter where that was in the gut, they find horses that had died suddenly, and they could take the ingest out of the gut. And they said the particles of large and small size are equally distributed throughout the gut. So they move at the same speed, which I thought was, to me, normal. I didn't know why smaller particles would move at a different rate than fast particles. But apparently in ruminants, that does happen. So I'm glad there are people out there who are looking at this stuff and realizing that the particle size is different, whether it's in the stomach or in the small intestines or the hindgut. But I'm not understanding why this makes a difference. I think the gut microbiome has to be attuned to whatever's supposed to be in that section of the gut, and they will do their job. I mean, they've been doing it for 50, 55 million years. Why are we worried about it now? And I think that all the time, these horses that they were looking at for particle size, they weren't telling me about their turnout, whether it was hay, whether it was grass, whether they had some sort of concentrate rations. So it was really one of these useless bits of time that I spent trying to learn something about horses. They did say something interesting. They said beet pulp, which I like to call sugar beet pulp, which is the byproduct of the sugar beet industry. They said is a roughage, but not a forage. And I thought that was a really cool distinction. And I understand that. They said the microbiome will not attach and use it as a food. So why are we feeding sugar beet pulp? I'm just baffled by it. So I stopped taking notes on that one because they brought on a guy who talked about the teeth, and he basically said, get the teeth filed and so they can chew really well and have good particle size. And it was such a letdown. So again, that's strike two. I don't even know why you're listening to this anymore, because you're hoping that maybe you'll get some pieces of information. But it's also important to know two things: that when you get information, you have to understand, is it valuable or not? And you have to weed through, what's really important versus what is not important. And here were two presentations, one by a veterinarian for Cornell University, another one by veterinarians in the European Union, all telling me about stuff that is not helping you, the horse owner. But it's good information, but it's limited. It's just a few horses that are looked at on postmortem, and we're trying to figure out if particle size makes a difference. And they said particle size is making a difference, but from me feeling inside horses' mouths every day and me pulling out hay every day, I find that the hay that's at the back of the mouth is ground up beautifully. Nature has an incredible way of doing that. And if your horse doesn't have great teeth, I'm sure it's not going to have great particle size. And then chopping up the hay is important so they can swallow it. But as far as I'm concerned, if a horse can swallow the hay or swallow the grass or swallow the ground plants, they will be able to digest it in the back. All right, the third one I went to see was the American Association of Equine Practitioners Laminitis rounds. And what I found interesting about the Laminitis rounds was this is part two. They had had this once before, and I suffered my way through it. These guys are brilliant. There's no doubt about it. There's nothing wrong with them or what they're presenting. But it's more toward veterinarians to help horses that have laminitis, and they never stop for a moment or bring in someone, an expert in what we can do to prevent laminitis. I've always said a million times over 1 billion years that the best laminitis case is the one that never occurs. So they went in to talk about the venogram, which means they inject a radiopaque dye into the foot, and then they take a radiograph, an x-ray, and you can see all the veins that are in the foot, and you can see where they are, how they're located, their quality of the vessels. And from that, they can determine if this horse has a chance or not. It's pretty interesting. And apparently, the Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine, New Bolton Center, has a PET, which is a special computerized X-ray machine that can do some pretty incredible things. Basically, you put glucose into the system, and where the glucose is taken up, it acknowledges that, and it's apparently does a very good job of identifying where inflammation is. But not everybody has a PET scan. Like one school in the whole United States, I'm thinking, has one. So what's the point of even talking about it? The first thing everybody agreed with is to raise the heel as soon as possible, 18 to 20 degrees. And they have this special product called the Ultimates, which they talked about a lot, which you put on the bottom of the foot and it raises the foot 18 to 20 degrees. And they couldn't talk enough about this. They thought it was the best thing. Raising the heel of a laminitic case basically takes the pressure of the deep digital flexor off the bottom of the hoof, so it's not pulling as the horse walks forward. It's like you wearing high heels. You don't have to pull the flexor tendon. If you've ever been to my the Horse Advocate website and you go into long toe, low heel, you'll see a video that I shot of Melissa walking in high heels versus clown shoes, which is low heel, long toe. And I put it into slow motion so you can see just how much effort there is to raise the hoof up to break over that long toe in clown shoes. And that's bad, because every time the horse pulls hard on the flexor tendon, it's going to rip that coffin bone away from the hoof wall. And that's not good. So everybody agrees you need to raise the heel up 18 to 20 degrees. So they're walking like they're on high heels. So it takes less effort to pull. So it's not going to pull that hoof away from the wall. They also talked about a rule of thumb that for every day that the horse has inflammation, they should be rested in a stall for a week. So their example was if they have 3 days of inflammation, which means you have the acute onset and you fight this inflammation for 1, 2, or 3 days, and you're getting a bounding pulse, heat in the foot, and you give ice and you give ice and anti-inflammatories. They suggest that 3 days of inflammation should be followed with 3 days of box stall, rest, and hand walk only. I think everyone's got their opinion on this. Some people say hand walking is good. Other people say don't hand walk at all because it's just going to tear the coffin bone away from the hoof. I think if you stop inflammation, that's step number one. And making the horse feel good is important. But unfortunately, feeling good doesn't stop the rotation of the sinking, they say, and I agree with them. The ultimates prevent rotation. If 5 degrees of rotation, then the increased angle of 18 degrees won't work. So they are saying that if the hoof is already rotated 5 degrees, raising it to 18 degrees isn't going to work. So you have to get these ultimates on or raise the heel 18 degrees in some way, shape, or form to get the horse to have less tension breaking over the toe. I think that's where a lot of people say, no, don't even walk the horse. If it's got 5 degrees or more of rotation, don't walk the horse. Somebody talked about adding sand to the stall, and it transforms the load from the wall to the sole and frog and decreases the dorsal strain and breakover, and they can easily turn on the sand. In other words, as they turn sideways, it gives. So they kind of like rotates. I like that. I've always been told that if you have a horse that's got colic, put them on cold water and put the base as sand, and then just fill it up with ice water, which sounds impossible to do, but that's really ideal. You know, people would take their ponies down to the creek and they'd find a sandy spot and let them stand in the creek in the sand with having the cold water go over them. That's a very classic and traditional way of treating laminitis. And so far in the state-of-the-art talk from AAP, they're agreeing that the old way is the best way. So they went on to talk about other things. They talked about using a drug called trazodone, which will decrease the number of steps taken and is good for a couple of days. And they talked about upright hooves will cause rotation, while flat hoof will cause sinkers. And then I stopped taking notes because either something came up or I just got bored silly with this. It was just on and on and on, and nobody's talking about prevention. And anybody knows me and this podcast and anything about me, it's always about getting, preventing this. And the best way to prevent them is, number one, stop causing insulin resistance. And number two, make sure you're feeding enough protein so the hoof is strong. So that's all I got to say about the AAP laminitis rounds. And the last one is a podcast that Purina put out called, it's called the Horse and Nutrition Podcast, and it's May of 2018. It was called Mythbusters. I found that and I said, I've got to listen to this. And they had 4 myths that they wanted to bust. Myth number 1, wheat bran. Is it good to feed? A lot of people like to do a brain mash with wheat bran, and they just discussed that it's the outer layer leaving the germ and it's high in phosphorus, which leads to big head disease. Now, we all know this. Most of the animal horse feeds that we get, senior feeds or performance feeds or any of the feeds, even the supplements, will have wheat middlings in there, which is basically wheat bran. It's a byproduct of the wheat milling process to make white flour. And with that, they always put in dicalcium phosphate to increase the calcium so you don't have a lot of big head or if you want to know the big word, is parathyroid hormone disease, nutritional secondary hyperparathyroidism, which means that they suck the calcium out of the bones and you get rickets. So brain really doesn't help. It alters the hindgut, causes loose feces, but it's not a laxative. It just makes the owner feel good. So feeding wheat bran as a laxative was a myth, and this person busted it. Second was high protein makes a horse hot. And I thought that was a good one. I wanted to hear this. And they said, increasing the number of calories will increase the behavior, and all foods, including alfalfa, will increase the amount of calories you're putting in there. And then they said increasing protein like 14% also causes increasing calories. And they said they didn't really bust this myth. They basically, I think, said that adding protein doesn't make them hot. It's just because of all the other things you're feeding them. I want to go a little bit deeper on this. What happens is if you feed protein along with inflammatory ingredients or ingredients that are high in glucose, the horse is going to turn that protein right into sugar. It just doesn't even make it into the system to be used for bones or enzymes or immune systems or neurotransmitters or connective tissue. It basically turns the protein into food that's put into the metabolic cycle. And we end up having a high protein diet that is really a high caloric diet. The secret to adding high protein to a horse is to decrease the amount of glucose that the horse is getting. And that's really what it takes. That's why I say you've got to stop feeding all foods to the horse other than pasture and hay. And that's going to cut down the glucose a lot. And by cutting the glucose down, you're going to cut down the insulin. And if your horse is obese or has metabolic syndrome already, you have to soak the hay and get the sugar out. And you have to limit the amount of hay the horse is getting. You have to decrease the amount of glucose a horse is getting to stop insulin. Once you stop insulin, you're going to decrease the need for more glucose from the proteins. And so the proteins will be allowed to be used for the top line formation, for improving the hoof, improving the tendons, improving the neurotransmitters. So it's a two-step process. You just can't throw protein at it. If you go on a high protein diet and yet you still eat sugar, you will have more fat storage. The classic example is you're eating, not your horse, but you're eating the standard American diet of, whatever you eat, 15 times a day. And at night you decide to go out to a steakhouse where they have, in the beginning, they have a bloomin' onion with a dip that has some sugar in it. And then you have this big steak, and then you have the baked potato, which is all glucose. And then you have a salad dressing that has sugar in it, some sort of ranch or house dressing that has sugar in it. And then you order the chocolate thunder from down under. And what happens is the insulin to glucagon ratio, which insulin is a hormone that takes sugar and brings it to the cells. And if it doesn't get accepted to the cells, it takes it to the fat cell, and it breaks the sugar down into a free fatty acid. It shoves it into the fat cell, and then it closes the door to the fat cell and prevents the fat from leaving. The whole purpose of eating sugar is to store body fat because winter's coming. And then there's its brother called glucagon. And glucagon says, hey, you just go away, big brother. I don't want you around, insulin. As soon as you're gone, I'll come over and open the door of the fat cell, and I'll start letting these fat molecules out so we can start losing the body fat. Well, if the glucagon is less than the insulin, in most standard American diets, it's about 4-to-1 insulin to glucagon, you're never going to lose weight. But it's interesting that if you have this high protein steak meal, as well as the chocolate, dessert and the baked potato and the sugar on the salad dressing, the insulin to glucagon ratio goes up to 70-to-1. There's 70 insulin for every glucagon. There's no way you're going to take off any fat. There's no way you're going to build muscle. There's no way you're going to utilize that protein. So everyone who's adding protein, a high protein food, and they see the horse get hot, what's happening is that protein is being converted right into glucose and is being burned and making the horse hotter. It's no different than if you gave him candy. And that's the truth of it. They didn't talk about it in the Purina's podcast, but of course, that would be in Purina's best interest to have them say, well, stop feeding grain. So that got a little muddy on that. The third one was, should you feed beet pulp? And they said it was a great source of digestible energy, and it has more calories per pound than grain, which I thought was interesting. So if you want to increase weight on your horse, they said replace 10 pounds of grass hay with 10 pounds of beet pulp, and you'll have weight gain. They said that beet pulp was low sugar and a low glycemic index, and only increases blood sugar by 2%, which is interesting because only 2% is a lot for equine metabolic syndrome or insulin resistant horse. And they did say don't feed beet pulp if you have equine metabolic syndrome, or if your horse is insulin resistant, you should stay away from beet pulp. I couldn't agree more. I just don't think a horse should be fed beet pulp because it's a byproduct. Again, byproducts are being dumped on you, the horse consumer, and you're paying to get rid of the byproduct of the sugar beet industry, which is the second leading source of sugar in America, first being sugarcane. They said you can add water, but it's not needed. It's low in trace minerals. It's low quality amino acids. It has a 10-to-1 calcium to phosphorus ratio. And I'm like, okay, who cares? So they're basically saying, yeah, you can feed beet pulp. You don't have to wet it, and it'll help put fat on your horse. I'm saying the only reason you're putting fat on your horse is because you're getting more glucose than they need in a day. And all that excess glucose is going to be converted over into body fat. And if your horse is gaining body fat, he's not healthy. If you cause the horse to lose body fat, in other words, if the body fat starts to melt off, that means only one thing. You've driven insulin down. Insulin is no longer the gatekeeper of the fat cells. It's no longer putting more fat into the cells. Glucagon is now available, so the fat is going to be pouring out of the cells, going to the muscle cells, being used as a fuel. And the cell can now become more efficient, and with more efficiency, it can start to clean up the mess that all the sugar is made. I'm going to be doing another podcast that's going to just talk about how glucose and fats are used one more time with new information. It's, to me, mind-boggling. But beet pulp, should use it? I say no, but Purina says yes. Of course, they sell it. Finally, number 4 was cutting commercial feeds with oats or beet pulp. I've always said, why are you spending all this money to have something that's properly formulated only to cut it with oats or beet pulp? It made no sense to me, but now I've changed my story. I don't care. If you're feeding it, if you want to cut it, it doesn't matter. All of it's going to cause harm to your horse. All of it's going to be inflammatory. All of it's going to increase the amount of sugar that's going into your horse. Unless your horse is 30, 35 years old and hanging on by a thread and can't put any body weight on, that's a whole different story. But for 99% of you listening to this, you have horses with excess weight. They've got a crusty neck. They got fat on the shoulders. They've got a fat rump. Their body condition score is 6 or 7 or 8. And you've got to stop feeding sugar. You've got to get that down. You've got to get high quality protein in there, because that's what's going to get the muscle back on and strengthen the hose and strengthen the connective tissue. So those are the 4 myths that went over, and I found it fascinating at the end. They said, the question said, where to find good nutrition info? And they're, I guess pandering is the right word. Their number one source of good nutrition information, they said, is your veterinarian. And I just laughed out loud because I love my profession. I love the veterinarians who are working hard out there. They're trying to do the best they can. But if you ask them what happens to the molecule of food once it gets absorbed into the gut, where does it go? What is insulin resistance? Why is it happening? Where's the top line? And all the other questions that we discuss here, they come up short. Now, I've got to tell you, 6, 7, 8 years ago, it came up short with me. When somebody said, what elements are in a fat molecule? I'd say, I don't know. I don't have a clue. But they're the same elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, that are in sugar. There's nothing else. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen make up all sugars and all fats. It's simple as that. And you've got to know why it's being shifted back and forth. And amino acids make up the proteins are also carbon, hydrogen, oxygen with nitrogen. And some of them have sulfur, and that's it. I mean, I don't have to go any further. Those are all the elements. The non-organic elements, the minerals, they play an important role, but they don't add to the fuel of the horse. And we're just talking about getting your horse in the proper weight and having the proper muscles. And there was another Purina podcast that's in the tank, and I'm deep-sixing it because none of those make sense. But I want to go over it because you're going to be listening to these podcasts too, and you're going to say, they're talking about the myths and they busted them, and Purina must know what they're talking about. No, don't feed wheat bran. High protein is being converted over to sugar. So be aware of that. And beet pulp is a byproduct of the sugar beet industry. And why are you feeding it? It's frustrating. I've got more notes here from a podcast of Dr. David Allison, who's a physician, on the science of obesity. I think that was fascinating. I'm listening to a brand new book put out by, good grief, I can see his name right now, Rick Johnson. And Rick Johnson is a physician and researcher who I have given you much information on the formation of uric acid from the Krebs cycle, and how that's causing high blood pressure in humans, as well as in decreasing insulin production. And uric acid is killing us, especially us men, more so than you women, because you women take uric acid and pee it out because you attach it to estrogen. But men with testosterone don't do that. And so we not only get gout, but we get high blood pressure. And as you hit menopause, you'll get high blood pressure from the uric acid. And uric acid is formed only when you eat fructose, which is the sugar of fruit. And worse than that, if you eat salt before you hydrate yourself, that's going to trigger this enzyme to convert glucose into fructose and get you fatter and make you unhealthier. And that's why a high salt diet should be avoided. It's not really a high salt diet. It's drink plenty of water before you eat that salted pretzel, which I wouldn't eat because the pretzel is made out of wheat. So here I am again, listening to podcasts, listening to just books. I listened to 3-hour podcasts from Dr. PhD Dom D'Agostino, who knows more about glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, and ketones. And I'm going to be doing at least one, if not 2 or 3 podcasts just on that. Not to overwhelm you, but for you to understand that every time you feed glucose or sugar to a horse or to yourself in excess of your daily needs, you're going to set off a reaction in your body that says, oh my gosh, there must be an ice age coming up, and we need to add more body fat. We have to do all these other changes, and our bodies are working perfectly until we die. Cancer is coming into everybody's life these days. At my age, I'm finding more and more people are having cancer. I personally have a nephew who is suffering from brain cancer, and he's got not too much longer to live. Don't send any comments on that. That's not the point. The point is, I know what they've been eating. I know what that family eats. And it's nothing like what they're saying. And in 1932, they figured out what is triggering this process that leads to cancerous cells. That's 1932. And yet it wasn't until 2008. And for those of you who are not really good at math, this is 2022. So that's only 14 years ago that they finally figured out how ketones work. That's only 14 years. And we all hear about the keto diet and ketogenesis and keto this, keto that. And yet nobody understands what exactly are ketones. And it's very simple. And I'm going to do a whole podcast on that to help you understand that it's okay for your horse to get some ketones floating around because it actually provides more energy. This is why I want to get you off glucose and onto fats. Your horse will actually have more energy for whatever sport you're in, and they will do so much better and maintain their protein. But if they knew in 1932 that this is the root cause of most cancers, why aren't we working harder to change things? And I just saw this horse with a nephrosplenic ligament entrapment, which is the type of colic, and I realized that didn't exist in the 1980s. That was not in the textbooks. And yet we can stick our arm in and feel this. It's so simple. You don't need any diagnostic tools. You can go in with your arm and say, whoops, the pelvic flexure is missing and the kidneys isn't where it's supposed to be. That's a nephrosplenic ligament entrapment. And yet I remember the first case in 1990 where the vet at Cornell said, "Oh my gosh, this is just like that new type of colic we just read about out of Sweden." There's so many new things that are happening to horses that we don't even realize because no one's telling us that they didn't occur back in the 80s. EOTRH of the front teeth, fractured teeth, dental caries didn't occur, wasn't in the textbooks in the 1980s. Drop fetlocks, not in the textbooks in the 1980s. Kissing spine, white line disease, this narcolepsy, yeah, they talked about it, but now it seems like everybody's got these horses falling down and sleeping out of nowhere. What's going on? And I keep looking back in time and I'm saying, this didn't happen in the 80s and then in the 70s when I started working with horses. It's coming up on 50 years and I'm seeing such a change. And that's why I'm here right now with you at the Horses Advocate podcast, bringing to you this eclectic group of stuff, not to confuse you, for you to hang up and say, what did I learn? It's all this stuff that's coming out, even from the top end veterinarians, that's not addressing the problem. It's not looking at how can we stop these things from happening. And that's why I'm glad you're here. That's why I'm glad you come here on a regular basis and you tell your friends, please go to your favorite podcast media, whether it's Apple or Spotify or Google Play or whatever, and leave a 5-star review and let people know about this. Copy and send it out. Tweet it now that Elon Musk is, highest private owner of Twitter. We've got to get all this information out. We have to start telling people that there are alternatives. Am I absolutely 100% correct? I don't know. I'm not doing randomized controlled studies because I don't have the money. Nobody has the money. Nobody's going to take 1,000 horses and do a randomized controlled study on these horses. It's all, anecdotal. It's all observational, and it's all about nutrition, which means it works for 10 horses over here and doesn't work for 10 horses over there. It's just everything's different. An Arabian in the Middle East is going to be different than a Pasofino in South America or Mongolian in China. We all have different genes, but it's well known now that cancers are being driven by epigenetics, which means the genes are being changed. And the number one driver of changing these genes is the diet that we eat. And we're causing most of these diseases that we have. And I'm tired of it. We just have to stop. So, yes, I've had a rough day. I spent a long time trying to explain this to some people, and I'm not too sure if they listened or they wanted to listen. They're getting conflicting information from their veterinarians on how to take care of this colic in a horse. And it's so frustrating, but I know you guys listening to this, I understand that you want to learn, you want to figure it out. So I'm going to ask you to come back and listen to some more podcasts that are coming up, or review some of the ones that you've missed in the past, or re-listen to them. And we're going to go over the same information presented in a different way on what happens to the molecule of glucose once it enters the body. Where does it go? What happens when there's oxygen or no oxygen? Aerobic or anaerobic? What's going to happen with these things? And how can we make our horses thrive in the human world, which is what we try to do here at the Horses Advocate. So thank you for joining. This is Doc T. I will talk with you next week. Bye.
Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's 2 reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.